we were just talking about the term paleo. Like I put up that we're gonna, talk about nutrition and diet and all that good stuff, and then somebody went to your page and it says, paleo and lifestyle expert. As soon as you have that word paleo, people go, "Oh fuck!"
Serious baggage. It's true. I mean, every day I think about, I kind of wish I never would have used this word.
Yeah. Well, Mark Sisson went with primal.
Yeah.
He uses that primal blueprint.
Yeah.
That's his sort of distinction of it.
I like that. I mean, they're both just words is what it really comes down to.
Yeah.
And I wrote a book that has the word paleo in it. And I thought about it even before I published the book. I was thinking, what I'm talking about is not really what people mean when they say paleo. It's a lot more inclusive and a lot less dogmatic. And if I use this word, there's going to be pros and cons. The pro is people recognize it. It's one word that points at a whole way of thinking. I could have called it the nutrient-dense ancestral, nutrition book, but that's not too catchy. There would have been like 5 people that read it. But on the other hand, paleo has a ton of baggage, as you said. People get a certain idea when they hear that word, and for some it's good. For others, it's kind of neutral. They don't know anything about it, and then for still others, it's like instant turn off. And why should we be emulating our paleo ancestors' lifestyles? They all died when they were 30. This is stupid.
Right.
Why should we do this? So it's a totally loaded term. I think we just need to get past it as an idea or a term and look at what it's really pointing at and evaluate it on that basis.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And also there was the issue with the term Paleolithic, like using the term paleo, and then there were some articles written about the actual diet of the Paleolithic people,
right,
where they ate everything they got a hold of. And if they got grains, they ate a ton of grains.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we know they weren't eating cheese doodles and drinking big gulps, right? So it's kind of easier to talk about paleo in terms of what it didn't include.
Right.
So it didn't include processed and refined, bread, flour, cookies, muffins, all kinds of packaged foods that comprise a large percentage of the American diet. I think the top 6 foods now are grain-based desserts, sugar-sweetened beverages, pizza, chicken dishes, which are like primarily fried chicken nuggets. Forgetting the other 2, but it's all crap.
That's the primary foods of America.
Those are the 6 primary foods of Americans. It's just completely nutrient depleted junk. So we can all agree that our Paleolithic ancestors weren't eating those foods.
Yeah.
And then we know it's pretty clear that they were eating a lot of meat. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about that. Meat and fish, wild fruits and vegetables, not the domesticated varieties that we're eating today, but wild fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, and some starchy plants. So those are the 2 extremes if we bracket it. And then things like grains and legumes were more of a question mark. Like there's some recent evidence that shows that legume consumption was probably pretty more common than we thought amongst our Paleolithic ancestors. They came later onto the scene, but if they were there, they probably ate them.
Is that based on geography, like where legumes are present?
Exactly, and what other food sources were available. It's pretty clear that they weren't the first option. If they were able to slaughter an animal, they would have done that and eaten the organs and the brain and probably thrown the muscle meat to the dogs.
Really?
Yeah, we have it backwards. I mean, when you look at traditional hunter-gatherers and the way they eat animals, they go just like wild animals do. When a wild animal kills another animal, it goes straight for the organs.
Right.
And that's because the organs are way more nutrient-dense than the muscle meats. And so traditional peoples, they knew the same thing, even without having access to science and, knowing even what a nutrient was. They just, over generations, figured out that eating the liver and the kidneys and the spleen and the brain was going to give them more energy, make them feel better, make them more fertile than eating the muscle meats.
But did they eat the muscle meats at all? I mean, it seems to me that
they probably did.
They're probably hungry,
yeah,
right?
They used every part of the animal, but it was clear that the organs were the favored thing to eat.
And how do we know this?
Just anthropological studies of hunter-gatherers, contemporary hunter-gatherers, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. There aren't many extant hunter-gatherer groups that we can even study now because they've all been basically assimilated. But, like the Hadza hunter-gatherers in Africa, and there are some groups that are still living a lifestyle that's relatively close to what they were living for the last 10,000 years, and we can learn a lot by studying those groups. And that's a pretty common theme in all of these traditional peoples, is they focused on eating the organ meats. Second would be probably meat and other animal products in terms of nutrient density. They ate a much broader variety of plant species than we eat. Like, across the world, most people eat, 4 to 8 plant species in their diet. Traditional hunter-gatherer groups, it was over 100.
Wow.
So they
just whatever was edible.
Huge diversity of plants. And that, of course, increased the nutrient density, increased the fiber that they were eating, which we now know feeds their beneficial gut bacteria, which has all kinds of benefits for health. And again, they weren't eating the foods that we are now, eating way more than we're eating anything else. And when I say we, I mean, just Americans or people living in the industrialized world in general. And that's a problem because of this concept of a species-appropriate diet. I mean, we know that all organisms evolve in a certain environment, and they're adapted to survive in that environment. And when their diet or lifestyle gets too far from what they evolved for, this mismatch occurs, and that mismatch is really responsible for all modern disease.
Yeah, that is something that I thought was really interesting about reading some of your work and some of your articles, that you had it sort of narrowed down to, I believe, the eight different factors that contribute to ill health that are a lot of times ignored when diseases are when someone gets diagnosed with an illness. Almost immediately there's a drug prescribed to treat the illness, but there's not like sort of backing up of the process to find out, okay, how did you get to this position? Like, what is your diet like? Are you getting enough sleep? What kind of stress are you under? Is your body exposed to toxins on a regular basis? Like, do you work with paint? You know what I mean? Are you near something that's really bad for you to breathe?
Yeah, I mean, the analogy I like to use is you have a rock in your shoe and it's making your foot hurt. You could take Advil, right? And it's you'll probably feel less pain, but you could also just take your shoe off and dump out the rock. And that would be a better idea, right? I think we can all agree on that. And our medical system is the equivalent of taking Advil when you have that rock in your shoe. If you have high blood pressure, you go to the doctor, you'll get a medication to lower it. If you have high cholesterol, you'll be prescribed a statin. And those can be effective at bringing those numbers down, but there's rarely any investigation into what's causing that symptom in the first place. And, the problem with that is if you take the high blood pressure medication, it lowers your blood pressure, but then you have no libido. And so what's the solution there? Another drug that increases your libido. You get Viagra, but then Viagra, causes some other side effect. And then you get prescribed another drug to deal with that side effect. And then by the time you're 65 or 70, you're taking 7 or 8 medications. And the statistics actually bear this out. Most people at that age are taking 2 handfuls of pills just to be able to get by, and that's really not the way that human beings evolved and are designed for.
It becomes a problem because there's a lot of money being made on selling those things.
Absolutely.
And the pharmaceutical industry is this gigantic monster of a business where they're just making billions and billions of dollars. And there's so much momentum when you have a big industry like that.
Absolutely. And they realized a while back that the big money in drugs is not in treating sick people, it's in treating healthy people. Because there are way more healthy people than there are sick people. And so once you get done with making drugs to treat diseases, you need to start making drugs to give to people who are fundamentally healthy, but maybe have like one lab marker that's out of range. So take statin drugs, for example. There's only a certain number of people that have already had heart attacks and are in danger of, high risk of having another heart attack. So if for statin drug sales to grow, they need to expand beyond that population and start, prescribing them to people who aren't necessarily at high risk for heart disease, but maybe have slightly high cholesterol, and that's where the real money is made.
Wow. So people that don't have really health consequences of this, like if you have high cholesterol, now high cholesterol is a lot of times associated with diet.
Yeah.
But the reality of cholesterol and like cholesterol-rich diets and blood lipids is that it doesn't really move the needle, does it?
Yeah, it's so much more complex than that.
What is the cause of, like, if a person has high cholesterol, what are the potential causes?
So diet is definitely one. Genetics are another, just, certain genetic polymorphisms that make you more susceptible to having high cholesterol. But there are a number of causes that are lesser known. So poor thyroid function is one cause, because thyroid hormones are required to clear LDL cholesterol from the circulation. So if you have, even suboptimal thyroid function, not frank, full-on hypothyroidism, but just a little bit of a problem with thyroid, your cholesterol can be high. And in fact, back in the 80s or 70s, before statins became, a bigger part of the treatment of high cholesterol, doctors used to use a low dose of thyroid hormone to treat high cholesterol. So they knew this at one time. Disrupted gut microbiome and leaky gut, which I know you've talked about before on the show with other guests. LDL is actually an antimicrobial substance, so the liver will make more LDL particles if there's endotoxins getting into the bloodstream from the gut. Infections can raise cholesterol, LDL, and toxins can do that too. So there's studies showing mercury toxicity, for example, can raise cholesterol. So these are all the potential underlying causes of high cholesterol. So if someone comes to see me and they have that problem, I'm going to test for all of those things, and I'm going to address those first, and then we see what happens. And if their lipids normalize after that, great. We've done our work, and then they avoid taking a drug that they never needed to take in the first place. If we retest and their levels are still high, then we have a bigger conversation about what the actual risk is given their level, their age, their sex, their family history, the absence or presence of other risk factors like high blood pressure and inflammation. So it's really complex, and there's this idea that there's just an arbitrary number for total cholesterol, and if you're higher than that, you need to take a statin, and if you're lower than that, you don't. I can't think of a good comparison right now, but it's ridiculously oversimplified.
And it also has some effect, or your amount of exercise, and your overall amount of what you put your body through as far as like stress, exercise, activity.
Yeah.
That has some sort of an effect on it as well, right?
Absolutely. Cholesterol is a repair substance too. So if there's any kind of damage, endothelial damage in the arteries, the lining of the arteries, cholesterol you can move to that site to repair the damage. Lifestyle choices definitely play a role. So, I think getting back to to the original point here, we need to be thinking more holistically about what causes disease and how to treat it, instead of just using Band-Aid approaches that suppress symptoms. I mean, we don't really have healthcare; we have disease management, and that's a fundamental difference that we need to understand. Like, if you think of disease as a spectrum, where the far end is death and here is perfect health. Very rarely do people go from perfect health to straight to death. I mean, that happens in trauma, accidents, and things like that. But usually we progress along that spectrum. And our conventional medical system is designed to intervene at the far end of that spectrum. When we're already kind of past the point of no return. We have these drugs that suppress symptoms. We have pretty amazing trauma care. Like, if I get hit by a bus, I want to go to the hospital. We're starting to be able to restore sight to the blind and do these incredible things, but they're all at that far end of the spectrum. Conventional medicine is really lousy at preventing disease in the first place, or treating it at this end of the spectrum when it's closer to health. and it's really bad at promoting health. In fact, in most medical school textbooks, there's not even a definition of health. It's just basically the absence of disease. But I think we can do better than that.
Yeah, it just seems logical. I mean, it seems that should be an approach that everyone should consider when you're looking at the broad spectrum of illnesses and diseases and injuries and all those different factors that are involved in making someone ill. That this is what you're saying seems so common sense, but it's not common at all.
Not common at all. It does seem common sense to me, and I think part of the problem, I mean, you hinted at it before with Big Pharma. It's like there's little incentive for Big Pharma to promote this kind of approach. Why? Why? You know, what's their interest in doing that? I mean, it means less sales for them. They're for-profit corporations that are publicly owned, and it's in their best interest of the shareholders to do things that grow the company and grow the business, right?
Unlimited
that's
growth.
That's
really.
how it is.
Yeah.
That's how our system is, and you know that's a whole nother discussion. But it's problematic when it comes to healthcare because you know the way it really should work is if you go into your doctor and you have high cholesterol, high blood pressure, your doctor sits down and asks you a whole bunch of questions about what you're eating, how you're living, are you sleeping, are you exercising, are you taking care of yourself, are you managing your stress? And then they do a whole bunch of testing. They don't just test your blood pressure, they don't just test your cholesterol, they test your gut. They test your HPA axis, which is what governs your whole stress response.
What is HPA?
Hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So it's the brain, basically the connection between the brain and the adrenal glands, and it governs our stress response. So there are ways that we can test it to see how you're being affected by stress. So if you're, you know, under a lot of stress, that's causing hormonal changes in your body. It can affect every aspect of your health. We can test for this. So they would do a lot of testing up front, which would be more expensive initially, but down the line it would save thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars per patient. So let's take someone with full-fledged type 2 diabetes. Depending on the estimate that I've seen, it can cost anywhere from $60,000 to $80,000 to $400,000 to care for that patient over their lifetime to the insurance company, because insurance is paying for a lot of these procedures. They develop, let's say, retinopathy. Later, they go blind. They require multiple operations and surgeries. They're taking expensive drugs. All of this stuff adds up. But let's say we could have spent $1,500 right off the bat before they even developed type 2 diabetes to identify what was happening and, you know, catch it before it happened and intervene then. Yeah, you spend a little bit more up front, but you end up saving tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars over the lifetime of the patient. So I think eventually the insurance companies are going to realize this because they're also for-profit businesses and they're interested ultimately in things that can save money. They just don't yet see functional medicine, which is what we're talking about right here, as something that could potentially save them a lot of money. They see it as something that they have to spend money on because the testing is more expensive up front, but they're not looking at the long-term game.
I wonder if pharmaceutical companies are just going to buy up the insurance companies and use it like as a write-off. You know, just go look.
A cynical person might have that thought.
I might be cynical. I mean, if I was a pharmaceutical company, I saw the writing on the wall, like, hey, people are having way more access to information about health than ever before, and they're going to start to make these healthy choices, and we're kind of fucked, guys. Listen, what we got to do is we got to get in there early.
Stranger things have happened, Joe.
There's a lot of problems with this in terms of like doctors. When you're a doctor, you have a line of patients waiting to get into your office, and you have a standard model of treatment that you've been sort of practicing for a long time. So to deviate from this path and to say, hey, you know, this whole rock in the shoe analogy that you brought up, which is brilliant. It's a perfect way to describe it. This all makes sense and it's logical and everything like that. But, you know, hey, insurance is not going to cover all these different tests. Yeah. We have a giant issue also in getting people to be proactive, to actually do something. How many people do we know, I know a bunch, that are fat, that talk about being fat, that have poor diets, that drink too much and eat too much sugar and constantly, eating crap and not exercising. They're 100% intellectually aware of this.
Yeah.
And they don't do a goddamn thing about it.
Yeah, you're right. It's a systemic problem. So if we break it down, you know, on the doctor care provider side and the patient side. So the care provider side, I mean, they're as much victims as we are, as patients are too, to this whole system that's been set up, because as you pointed out, like the way the system works, most doctors who are working in an HMO type of setting have like 7 to 10 minutes to spend with the patient.
That's so crazy.
That's not enough time to have the kind of conversation that you need to have, even to get beyond saying hello and writing a prescription,
Yeah.
which is basically what happens in most of those encounters. And then you also mentioned the standard of care. So they're legally required to take certain actions in certain circumstances, and their medical license and their whole career could be at risk if they don't do that. So even if they question, for example, prescribing statins to a patient who has a total cholesterol of 240 but no other risk factors, if they don't do that, then they could actually lose their job. And so,
Wow.
so it's not, I'm not being critical of individual doctors here. I'm criticizing the whole system that we've created. That I know many doctors, I train doctors, and I know many doctors, and I can say that most of them are aware that the way that we're doing things is not working, and they want to change it as much as anybody else, but they feel constrained by the system. And then the other problem is, you know, us as individuals, like the level of responsibility for our own health that we take. And I think, you know, we all ultimately are responsible. So let me just say that. But it's also true that we're influenced by the system that we are a part of. And so, you know, you get this whole culture which is basically oriented around disease management and suppressing symptoms with drugs, and that's what patients come to expect. And so I've heard from many doctors, and there have actually been studies on this, so that patients will go in to the doctor and they'll request a drug, and they won't be satisfied unless they leave with a prescription for that drug, whether it's indicated for them or not. And this is because we're one of only 2 countries in the world that has direct-to-consumer drug advertising. The U.S. and New Zealand are the only 2 countries in the whole world that allow ads in magazines that are targeted towards consumers for drugs. And the risk in doing this is exactly what we're talking about now. You get someone who's seen a drug ad in a magazine, they're like, I need that drug. They go into the doctor, they ask for it. The doctor knows it's not right for them, but the patient's not going to be satisfied unless they get that prescription, so the doctor caves and gives them that prescription.